simply because my notes are here. And thank you to the organizers. It's really a wonderful conference from which I'm learning a great deal, and I'm taking copious notes. And it's really, one cannot even imagine a better scenery out of from the window. So let us start. Walter Benjamin believed that a good historical materialist, like old 19th century positivists, should always try and brush history against the grain. So I will try to begin, without being a historical materialist myself, to start from the very end. And the end of our story is that slide you can see before you. And we will do this by examining a material object, a photo, reproduced here. It was taken in New Delhi in late March or early April 1947, short time before the climatic events that we now call the partition of India, less than 3 months before India declared its own independence in August 1947, and it was roughly a bit more than a year, 13 months, before the new nation-state named Israel was declared independent in the Middle East, again as a result of another partition plan that was agreed upon by the UN. And I assume that I don't need to introduce the gentlemen and all the people in the photo, especially the gentleman on the right, our left, the protagonist of this conference, Shmuel Hugo Bergmann. Nor I assume I need to introduce Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru at the center of the photo, who was then the head of the provisional government that was preparing for India's independence. And on Nehru's other side, wearing glasses, you could see David HaKohen, a Russian Jewish Zionist diplomat trained at the LSE, who became one of the founders of the Israeli Foreign Office. Now, while Bergmann, as we know, was busy introducing both binationalist ideas and Kantian philosophy to Jerusalem, Cohen, despite his appearance as a boring intellectual, had a very stormy 1940s. He spent this stormy decade first in charge of the secret negotiations and coordination between the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary force in the Yishuv, and the SOE, the Special Operation Executive of the British Army. They were helping to fight Vichy forces in Lebanon. It was from Cohen's private department in Haifa that Radio Levant France Libre broadcasted, for instance. But later on, and I mentioned this trajectory on purpose, when the British will try to crush Zionist anti-British sentiment, he will be one of the first to be arrested during Operation Agatha, what the Zionists remember as the Black Sabbath. So that's part of a longer story I will allude to. So how is that connected to our story, and what brings these two Zionist gentlemen to India? This is in a way what I would like to say in the following moments. In a way, what is the road that is led them to the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi? And the aim of my talk is therefore to answer this question, and my intervention in these proceedings therefore has a very contextual historicist flavor. I would talk less about Bergmann himself, and I will try to situate him within a broader context of what I would offer calling Zionist Asianism. And by Zionist Asianism, I mean the effort to forge political ties and reimagine the Jewish political renaissance that would be parallel with and collaborate with non-European and non-Western nationalism. Now, Zionist Asianism, as I defined it, was much a sentiment as a political strategy. It was predicated on Zionist thought from its inception, but it was also grew out of an inherent cultural ambivalence concerning the otherness of the Jew that animated in that thought. And this ambivalence was tied and even further fostered an intra-Zionist discord between Eastern and Western conceptions of Jewishness within Jewish thought. So in a way, I would propose to see it also as part of a larger trajectory, and here I'm kind of following the footsteps of my Dr. Vater, Stephen Asheim, that talked about brothers and strangers, and this dialectic and how it was colored in Zionist thought. But second, Zionist Asianism never became, of course, a mainstream orientation. It rather developed through a constant negotiation with other Zionists who generally denied any affinity between Jews and the people of the East. And Zionist Asianism tried to position the Jewish National Project within an imagined East that would be in contrast with Europe, an imagined space of plurality and diversity, an alternative primordial home, free from anti-Semitism, hyper-nationalism, and ethno-national divide. So in contrasting their imagined Asia, most of the proponents of this Eastern recalibration did not distinguish necessarily between Asia, the Orient, the Levant, the East, and many of these terms are used very interchangeably and very loosely. But third, and most crucially, to understand Zionist Asianism properly, we must undertake the imperial turn. We should abandon the tendency so common among Zionist historiography, but also among post-colonial nation states, to write the history of empire off their chronicles when presenting a narrative, a heroic narrative of a struggle to the state in the making, and culminating, of course, in that moment of independence. Furthermore, in the context of our proceedings and talk today, the British Empire was a crucial translocal and political infrastructure that made the very idea that Zionists and Asian nationalists have some sort of affinity far less abstract and much more conceivable. And if you would like, the idea that New Delhi and Jerusalem are part of one political space was not an abstract theorem, but a reality from 1917 onwards. So this is a period in which Bergmann is operating in a place where, in an empire where the sun never sets, and these remote areas are part of this bigger concept. And lastly, I've alluded here to Panga Mishra's famous book about the East. This is also an important element of our discussion because the roots of Zionist Asianism, if you would like, I will propose, are located in an intersection between a very Jewish discourse or different fashions and currents that we can see at the time, and we can return to it in the Q&A. On the one hand, it's that very Buberian-inspired sentiment and attempt to reclaim Jewish Oriental roots, part of a battle cry of, again, to allude to Asheim's term, a post-Bildung generation that questions the underlying assumptions of the old or of their parents. But the second trend of fashion that was not unique to Jews was the rediscovery of the Far East, described so eloquently by Panga Mishra in his From Ruins of Empire, for instance, that locates the beginning of this fascination in circa 1904-5 with Japan's epical defeat of Russia, that suddenly the East was seen as a rising power. And very briefly, the story of the Jewish reception of the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, if you'd like, is a very illustrative example in that respect. Jewish intellectuals did not invent the wheel, but partook in the fashions of their day when they discovered Tagore. Tagore had been awarded Nobel Prize in 1913, Nobel Prize in Literature, admired by European modernists, was enchanted, many of them were enchanted by Tagore because it was a symbol of this wisdom of the Far East, but often it was part of a framework of a transnational and bilingual investigation. For instance, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats who was a very instrumental pusher behind the scenes that helped Tagore win the Nobel Prize, was part of that circle. So it was seen as part of this cross-fertilization and mystical religiosity and modern political imagination in the works of this Bengali poet that corresponded with his Irish interlocutor. Again, you see a very British imperial connection taking place here. Thus, Tagore was considered a spokesman of this kind of Eastern spirituality and an advocate of an inter-Asian cooperation, intellectual decolonization. And when, for instance, you see David Frischmann starting to translate him into Hebrew, therefore, he's not doing something which is not in line with the fashions of his time. He was the first one to start translating short poems and stories by Rabindranath Tagore in what could be almost described as an illustration of the English idiom parrot fashion. By the time that Frischmann discovered Tagore is already a big name, and even more so, notably Frischmann did not translate him from the original Bengali, but relied on Tagore's translation into English. And even more important in our context, Frischmann will be the same person to translate into Hebrew the famous proto-Zionist novel Daniel de Ronda by George Eliot, and to admire the empire in that respect. He published it earlier on in 1893 in Warsaw. Frischmann, by the way, was not a Zionist. And I mention it because there's no contradiction between that kind of a very imperial novel and the Bengali expression. And later on, the Zionists would go back to Daniel de Ronda as a novel that presents the Zionist claim. And Frischmann, by the way, was very skeptical of this kind of type of praising of the Israeli and others. So it would be an error to suggest that translating Tagore thus signified the beginning of some sort of a Jewish decolonization or post-colonial sentiment avant la lettre. It was actually part of the fashions of the period, and given the fact that Shmuel Lev is here, I do not need to go into detail and to talk about Shlomit Flam, the forgotten idealist educator, who may very well be described as under the title the first Hebrew backpacker who traveled to India in the early 20s and 30s to stay in Tagore's ashram and so on. And if you'd like an interesting illustration of the type these type of collections can be found in Israeli streets. Not often you will find in Israel streets named after foreign personalities. Masalik, I could not resist the temptation, is one example. Tagore is another example. We can talk about it later on in our discussion. Nor do I have the time here to talk in great detail about the fact that the founders of the Hebrew University would invite in 1918-19 the Scottish civil town planner Patrick Geddes, you can see him bearded in his white suit here, to prepare the first plans of the Hebrew University. How is it connected to the East? Geddes is a British romanticist that is a very harsh critic of modernization, rapid industrialization, and he is relocating himself from Edinburgh to India, building a new university for central India, a good friend with Tagore, and these are the networks that are bringing him to Jerusalem. It was mentioned here by Tzvi that Bergmann is in London. He's not simply moving directly from Prague to Jerusalem. He's passing through London exactly at the period when Geddes is brought into Palestine. So that's part of that larger trajectory. And I'm curious to hear if we have documents from his time, short period at the Department of Education and Culture of the Zionist Administration in London, that you see it. But these are the people that bring Geddes to plan the Hebrew University. So what is important in the context of our conversation today is that when Zionists turned their gaze on India, the subcontinent fascinated them quite a while before they imagined it as offering a non-nationalist, pacifist nationalism, and because they were driven by a passionate belief that in Zionism's ability to be a bridge between East and West, and Bergmann, I think, plays a very important role in here, even, and of course the Brit Shalom group is part of it. But before we rush right to the Brit Shalom group that is very well researched, I would like to add to our equation an almost entirely forgotten discourse and plan that surfaced in 1927 that to turn Palestine into the seventh dominion of the British Empire. And this was a plan that emerged a bit like Brit Shalom out of frustration from the early mandatory period and its government. And it's a brainchild of the gentleman you can see here, Colonel Josiah Wedgwood. There's a connection with India here as well. Wedgwood is a admirer of the sacrifice that the Indian troops had during World War I. There's no Mesopotamia that would be gained without the sacrifice of the Indian troops. And he's the one that will offer to turn Palestine into the seventh dominion. Why seven? That's part of a forgotten chronicle of the British Empire, which is extremely important in the context of our discussion. The British Empire reorganizes itself in the early 20th century, and especially after World War I, as a federation that encourages creation of new creatures that we call dominions. The first one would be, of course, Canada. Yes, that's the original flag before they changed it with the Union Jack on it. Of course, New Zealand, Australia, and the Union of South Africa, which is a very important element. And if you can see also the sixth dominion before Palestine is, of course, the Irish Free State. Why am I calling it the Irish Free State? Until 1949, the partition of Ireland creates an independent state, which still is part of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and they're still paying loyalty, they still have an oath of loyalty to the British Crown. So that's the program that is proposed for Palestine by the British themselves, and surprise, surprise, you will have many Zionists who are saying, that's not a bad bargain. That's actually a great idea. It would come from the circles that are surrounding Weizmann. The first people to take it seriously are none others but the revisionist Zionists. But even a labor Zionist leader like Chaim Olozorov here is taking it very seriously. He's not dismissing it as a crazy idea. In a famous essay that, again, famous for the two historians who are studying it, he will say it's not a bad idea, it's simply too early, and he's imagining the British Empire acquiring more dominions, and he would simply say, I would not go into that long quotation, just look at the title of the article, Palestine will be the ninth dominion. His prognosis is of greater dominions that will join the Commonwealth, and this is not an empty idea. I would just turn your attention to the very last sentence here in his article. It's the idea that Palestine will become a dominion, that part of the ground is a crown, is not incompatible with the Zionist idea, and for him, for that exact reason, the phrase der Judenstaat, the Jewish state or the state of the Jews, which appeared in the cover of Dr. Herzl's booklet, was purposely left underdeveloped. What would be the exact constitutional framework is open-ended, and that's not contradicting any type of Zionism. These are not empty talks. What Olozorov does in the last years before he's assassinated is starting to look at the history of the British Empire and translate into Hebrew a very famous book on the history of the empire, which is very pro-empire, have no doubts about it. And it's amazing how Shlomo Avineri can write an entire biography of Olozorov without even mentioning it in a footnote, and so on. Why is that important? Because in that context, you have the revisionists and their friends starting to think about new types of ideas about what is self-governance, if you would like, what is the equivalent of the Jewish Swaraj as Gandhi was developing it. And it would be in this context that a new Hebrew word is coined, and that's the word atzmaut. The word atzmaut is coined by the individual you can see here, Itamar ben Avi, and he is saying in so many words in his biography, I was looking for a Hebrew term that would be an equivalent to the Latin phrase autonomia, not independence. There's no problem to say in Hebrew, not dependent, include. We don't need any word for it. So if you see appearances of the word atzmaut in documents from the 1930s, what he has in mind is an autonomy and not a nation state. And our tendency to read back a nation state into it is very important. And he is fascinated by the East. Ben Avi is looking at what Gandhi is doing and the way Gandhi is promoting his politics, and also, and I'm using this famous photo from the Round Table Conference in 1931, also to show his politics through his sartorial choices, and he sees India as a model. He's using his newspaper Dor Hayom to advance it, and he sees these projects in parallel. That's what told me Gandhi. Time has come for the Eastern nations to become the leaders of culture. I am glad that the Jews are part of this revival of Asia. Why is it fascinating? Not only because he's an Asianist and he's preparing the ground to what would later be called in Israel the Canaanites, but also because it's not incompatible with admiration of the empire. For him, the empire opened the gates to the east, and that's part of it. And I'm drawing it to a close. So how is it connected to our individual? Part of what is going on at the Hebrew University in its early years, when Bergmann is operating, is exactly this attempt to found, a cultural center which sees itself as an Ahad Amian-inspired Zionist cultural center, but they don't know how to react to the idea of the nation state and the empire. And the founding and few of the key figures that will create sort of the humanistic studies at the Hebrew University are actually debating on this. If you will look at Richard Kemmler, a Breslau-born German Jew that immigrates to Palestine not because he's a Zionist, but because he loses his job, he becomes, in Palestine, an admirer of the British Empire and fights against the new generation of young students, including Bibi Netanyahu's father, that are admiring the anti-colonial forces. If you look at Leon Chaim Rod, closest partner with Bergmann when it comes to founding the philosophy department, he's an Anglo-Jew decorated soldier from World War I, and he is the Ahad Am chair of philosophy at the Hebrew University, and he believes that Mitzion, etc., from Zion, you will have a cultural renaissance, and it will be spread throughout the commonwealth. So in a way, part of what you see in the 1940s is how these predicaments are being questioned. After 1948, part of what you will see is that you will have a departure in which Richard Kemmler, the minute he will reach retirement age in 1955, will move out from Palestine to Manchester, where he dies after leaving behind him two phenomenal books on the history of the word empire and imperialism, and will die in Manchester. And Leon Roth will retire early after being the rector of the university and return to Britain as well, and will die in New Zealand in 1963. Bergmann is the only one that stays, and he's the only one that is able to converse with the young generation of native-born Palestinian Jews that will become the Israelis, especially from the labor, those who are affiliated with the labor movement. So I threw a lot of on the table here, and I only touched the tip of an iceberg, but I look forward to your questions and the discussion elsewhere, and I hope that it prepares the ground to the other conversation about Bergmann and the East. Thank you.